The Sony A7 IV has quickly become my go-to camera for pretty much everything. Even at Sony Kondo, I use the A7 IV nearly the entire time. It's that good of a camera. So for this video, I'm going to share my exact camera settings with you for free. That's right, for free, and you can download my A7 IV settings in the link below, install them onto your camera, which should take you about 2 minutes, hence the title of this video. So you can go off and do that, but if you want to stick around, I'm going to explain all my camera settings, which I believe are the most optimized and efficient settings for the Sony A7 IV. Let's start out with my customized button layout on the camera. We'll start with the top. Over here is where I change my shutter speed. By default, that's where you change the aperture. In fact, these two dials over here, I have flipped because I come from a Canon background, and so this dial is to change the shutter speed, and this dial is to change the aperture. The dial next to that is my exposure compensation dial, and so if I'm using auto ISO, I can determine the exposure by rotating the dial over here. This little red button is the record button, no changes there. Same thing with the shutter button to take photos right over here, but the C2 button, I've changed it to be crop mode or APS-C mode. And so if I want to go from full frame to APS-C mode, I just press the C2 button and then my camera goes into APS-C mode. Very handy if I want to punch in on a shot, whether it's videos or photos, and very convenient for me that it's easily accessible because it's right there on the top. And the last thing on top is the mode dial, which allows you to go into different modes for video and for photos. Here you have manual mode, you have shutter priority, aperture priority. I'm not going to get into that per se. We will talk about this dial later in the video, specifically with the custom dials 1, 2, and 3. I use those custom dials to go into my favorite presets. Again, I'll talk about that later in the video. In fact, I've made a video talking about my 11 different custom modes for the A7 IV, and you can watch that video up over here if you haven't already. Now moving on to my custom buttons in the back, starting with the left going to the right, let's talk about the C3 button, which I programmed to be the face eye priority button. Basically, when I turn this feature on, the camera will lock on to my eyes, and when I turn this feature off, the camera will focus on the object that's closest to the camera. Very handy if I'm showcasing a product towards the camera and I don't want the camera to focus on my eyes. If I want the camera to focus on the product, I make sure to turn that feature off. And if I'm not showing a product, if I'm vlogging or I'm doing a talking head in my studio, I make sure that this feature is turned on. The menu button is of course the menu button, no need to change anything there. The C1 button, however, is where I change the focus area. For me, I like using different focus areas depending on what I'm filming. I like using the zone focus area, sometimes I like it in the center, and sometimes I like using the spot focus area if I want to focus on a specific detail of an object. And of course, I like using the wide focus area because the Sony A7 IV is pretty dang good at figuring out which objects or subject to focus on. But with the C1 button, I just keep pressing it until I find the right focus area to use. The AF on button is my autofocus manual focus toggle, so I just press it once, it'll go into manual focus. I press it again, it'll go back to autofocus. The button next to that, my AEL button, I've changed that to be clear image zoom, because not only can the A7 IV zoom in on your shot by using crop mode, but you can zoom in even further by using clear image zoom. Check this out. So here's a shot in full frame, here it is in crop mode, and here it is using clear image zoom. Cool. Again, all easy access because it's right there next to my thumb. Moving on down, the joystick button, obviously you can use that to navigate through the menu, but if you press it down, that'll toggle whether you want to use the monitor or the EVF. This is really helpful if you want to save battery on your camera and you don't want to burn out your battery by having the LCD monitor on the entire time. For me, if I'm filming like long segments like an interview, I just press down on my joystick to turn off my monitor and press the joystick down again if I want to see the image pop back up. Below that is the function button, and that'll open up a menu where you have quick access to your favorite features. We'll talk about that later in the video. And down below that is your directional pad. And for the most part, I left it to the default settings. Like if you press up on the display pad, that'll toggle your different display options on the monitor. If you press left on the directional pad, that'll determine the drive speed of your camera for photography. So if you want to shoot into high bursts or not so high bursts, or if you want to use your timer, this button will help you set that. If you press the right button on the directional pad, that'll help you set whatever ISO value that you want. But when you press the down button on the directional pad, I've set that to determine my white balance. Of course, you can set that to whatever you want, but for me, I like changing the white balance with the down button on the directional pad. Oh, and the last thing on the directional pad is this center button over here. If you press it, that'll open up my picture profile settings. And so if I want to switch from S-Log3 to S-Cinetone or whatever I want, that's the button that I press to toggle that. And then the last two buttons, the play button is of course the play button. I can use that to play back whatever video or photos that I want. And then the C4 button or the trash button, that toggles my zebras. And I use zebras to help me expose for specific scenes. Really helpful if I'm filming outdoors. Having zebras displayed on the monitor is just very helpful for proper exposure. And I think that's pretty much it for all the buttons on the camera body. If you do have a lens that has a multi-function button on the side, like this lens over here, for this setup, I've assigned the multi-function button on the lens to activate focus magnify. And basically, this is really good if you are focusing manually. The camera will zoom in by a lot, and there you can see a very zoomed in image of your scene where you can focus manually. Pretty helpful for astrophotography, but other than that, those are all my customized buttons on the A7 IV. Now let's get into the menu. All right, first we're gonna go into photo mode. So on the dial on the top of the camera, just switch the dial to the photo icon because each mode will open up different options in the menu. Now with the menu open, we're just gonna go page by page. And also if I skip on a certain part of the menu, it's because I've left it to the default settings. I'm just gonna focus on the features that I have specifically changed. And in this menu, this is where I've set your favorite options within the menu. For me, these are settings that I often use, like format if I want to erase one or two of the SD cards. The camera set memory is where I set specific settings for a given mode. So for example, if I'm shooting outside and I want my ISO to be always at 100, I just make that change on my camera or whatever settings I want. And once those changes are made, I just go to camera set memory, and then my camera will memorize whatever settings that I've changed on my camera. And then down below are other settings that I commonly use, like file format or movie settings or SNQ settings. You can change this favorites menu however you want, but one thing I do recommend is adding the USB connection mode, because this is the mode that you use if you want to use your A7 IV as a web camera. Basically, you have to click on this feature first before you plug in your USB-C cable to live stream. Again, whatever setting that you go to most, you can add over here, but these are my favorite and commonly used settings in the menu. You can also add different menus if you want to, whether it's specifically for video or for photo, but I just like having one favorites menu with these settings. Going back out, let's go to the next tab. Now this is the only section in the photo mode that I change, and I don't really change anything too much. I mean, when it comes to photos, I always shoot in JPEG and RAW, and so when I first set up the A7 IV, that is the only thing that I change. To access that, you go to image quality, and then here where it says file format, you can choose to shoot either just RAW or JPEGs, or in my instance, RAW and JPEGs. And once that is set, let's switch our dial from photo mode to movie mode. All right, back in the menu, let's go to this tab and let's go to image quality. For file format, I like shooting in XAVC 4K. I feel like it's a very balanced compression when it comes to video files. If you open it up, there's a variety of file formats that you can record in, whether it's XAVC HS 4K, which is a very compressed file. I'm not a big fan of that because it requires a powerful computer to uncompress that video footage. You also have other options like XAVC SHD, which of course means you are filming in HD, not 4K, but HD. And the bottom two options are the least compressed file formats. You have XAVC SI 4K and XAVC SI HD. All you have to know is that the top option is the most compressed video file. The next two options are the most balanced file compressions, and the last two options are the least compressed file options. Again, you do you, but I feel like XAVC S4K is the most balanced. Going down to movie settings, I often like recording in 24 frames per second and in 10-bit 422 video. Basically, I'm filming with a lot of data, which makes it really easy for me to color grade specific things. You don't have to do that. In fact, it's quite unnecessary most of the time, but as a filmmaker, I just love shooting in 10-bit, and so that's what I like to shoot in. Of course, with the record frame rate, you can record up to 60p in 4K with the Sony A7 IV. You can record in 120 frames per second, but you have to set your file format to XAVC SHD, which isn't the end of the world. I mean, HD video on the A7 IV is still pretty good. It's just that 4K just looks a little better. And down below that is SNQ settings, and I love SNQ because I like filming time lapses, and instead of taking photos at intervals, like I can just record my time lapses in camera. And the best way to do that is by using SNQ. So for example, if you want your final time lapse to have that 24 frames per second look, just make sure to set the record frame rate to 24p, and your frame rate, if you want your time lapse to go fast, I'd probably set it to like 1 frames per second or 2 frames per second, or maybe something higher if you're shooting something like the sunrise or sunset. That's a whole video in itself, but in a nutshell, to film quick time lapses with the A7 IV, I like using SNQ. Down below that is proxy settings. Now, I don't really use proxy settings anymore, and basically what proxies are is that you're recording a smaller video file along with your bigger video file. This is great if you have a computer that's not as powerful. You can use proxy video files to edit your video, and once you're done with your edit, you can swap the proxy files to the original video files so that when you're ready to export, you will export a higher resolution version of that video. But since I don't use proxy recordings, we don't really need to get into that. APS-C 35 shooting, I've set to auto, and then lens compensation. The only thing that I use with lens compensation is breathing compensation. We won't get into it too much, but basically if you have a lens that tends to focus breathe, or if the focus moves in and out, breathing compensation just kind of compensates for that by cropping in on the image just by a little bit. All right, moving on to media. The only thing that I change in this area is to record media settings. Basically, this determines what is recorded onto what SD card. For me, I like taking photos on SD card slot number 2 and recording video on SD card slot number 1. Just makes it super easy for me to determine where videos and photos are. All right, moving on, we have file and file settings. And the only thing that I change here is the file name format. In fact, it may be the default setting for the A7 IV. Like what you see in the bottom, it says the year, month, date. It just makes it super easy for me to organize. And if you notice the other characters after that, you'll see an underscore A7 IV. Well, I've set the camera to name every file shot with the A7 IV have A7 IV in it, because when I'm editing and gathering different types of footage, seeing that file name helps me know that this specific video file was shot on the A7 IV. And you can change that with the title name settings down over here. And this is really all I've put. I just put A7 IV underscore, hit OK. And now every video file that I've recorded has its specific date, has the A7 IV in the title, as well as the original file number. Again, just a really great way to organize your video files. Moving down to shooting mode. This is where I set my camera to memorize specific settings of the camera. It's this little setting right over here. We talked about this earlier in the video. I've set this setting to be in my favorites menu right over here. And then moving down, USB streaming. Again, this is the setting that you use prior to live streaming with the A7 IV. We already talked about that, so let's move on down to shutter and silent. Basically, if you want your camera to be quiet, if you are filming or taking photos, activating silent mode is the way to do that. This is specifically helpful for filmmakers who shoot weddings. Like, you don't want the bridegroom or the wedding party to hear your stupid camera. And so if you want to just shoot silently like a ninja, this is the setting to do that. And then moving down to audio recording, the only thing that I change here is the audio record level. I always record at audio level 10. I feel like it's the most balanced. It's not too quiet, it's not too loud. It's just the right balance for all of my mics. And again, if you've downloaded my A7 IV settings, all these settings will be already there for you. Moving on, I don't really mess with time code unless I'm doing multi-camera sync, but I don't even do that, so let's skip that. Image stabilization, of course I use that. We'll talk about that later in the video and how you can access that, but you can activate and change those settings right over here. Same thing for zoom. Shooting display, I just make sure to have the grid line display on. I like using the rule of thirds. It just helps me compose my shot and also level out the horizon. You don't have to do it, but I personally like using grid lines. Marker display, I think I've left it to the default settings, so let's move on to the next tab, which is our exposure settings. So for the exposure, the only setting that I change here is the ISO range limit, and that is if I decide to use auto ISO with the A7 IV. Here I've set the minimum ISO to be 50 and the maximum to be ISO 4000. I mean, technically the camera can go up to 6400 without seeing any grain, but for me, I don't really see a need to go past 4000. And if I need to increase the ISO that much more, then I'll just use the A7S III because it's just better. But again, you do you if you want to change the maximum ISO setting. Going back down to exposure compensation, that's already set by the exposure compensation dial that I showed you earlier in the video, so we're just going to skip that. Let's go down to metering. The only thing that I sometimes use is face priority in multi-metering. And basically what that does is that it'll prioritize metering for the face, which is really handy if you're filming someone going from outside to inside. Sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't, but if you want to use this feature, you can totally do so. Moving on to white balance, I typically like to shoot in daylight just to make sure that everything is consistent, but sometimes I do like using auto white balance, so you can set those settings right over here. Moving down to color tone, and the only thing that I really use in this section is the picture profile, and I like using two picture profiles quite often, either S-Log3, which is PP8, or S-Cinetone, which is PP11. S-Cinetone is what I use to film when I'm indoors, but if I'm filming outdoors, then I'll shoot an S-Log3 just because it's better handling dynamic range. And then for soft skin effect, I never use because it'll make my face look like a mannequin. So yeah, I mean, if you want to use it, sure, why not? But for me, yeah, I don't like using the soft skin effect. And then zebra displays, I do like using zebras to help me expose, but instead of going to the menu and activating it here, I like using that custom 4 button that I showed you earlier in the video. All right, moving on to autofocus manual autofocus. Here for the focus mode, I always have continuous autofocus on, and everything else is set to the default settings of the A7 IV. I don't think I've changed anything as far as autofocus transition speeds or sensitivity. I've just set both to 5. So there's that. Moving on, we got focus area. Again, I have a button on the camera to cycle through the different focus areas that I like. Feel free to have a look and choose whatever you want over here, but let's move on to face eye autofocus. Here you can get really specific as far as autofocusing goes. I mean, if you're a portrait photographer, this is probably going to be helpful if you want to focus on the right eye or left eye of your subject. You can also choose the type of subject that you are shooting, whether it's a human, animal, or bird. Really cool feature, and you can play with those features in this section of the menu. Moving on, we have Focus Assistant. This is a really interesting part of the menu because here you can choose a focus map. Basically, when you use focus map, you can see your focus points represented in colors. Really cool way to help you nail down your focus if you're focusing manually outdoors. I don't use it too often because I always use autofocus, but a really good feature for you manual focus lovers out there. And then focus magnifier, that's activated by the multi-function button on the side of my lens. And then down below that where it says initial focus magnification, you can determine whether it's 1x or 4x. And moving on to peaking display, this is another feature to help you see what is in focus and what is not. That can be represented by certain colors, whether it's white, blue, yellow, or red. Again, another cool feature for you manual focus lovers. Moving on to the play tab. I don't really think I've changed anything at all in the play tab. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. You press a play button and you just play back your video or photos. So let's just move on from there. Network. Okay, so this is where you connect your camera to your phone. If you want to register and connect your camera to the phone, just go to Smartphone Connect, Smartphone Register, and there you can use the on-screen instructions to connect your camera to your phone. We're not going to go into that. We're going to move on, but the A7 IV is fantastic for sending video and photos straight to your phone. Moving on, transfer and remote. The only thing that I use here is the Bluetooth remote control, and that is if I'm using a wireless grip or some sort of remote with the A7 IV. I have neither, so we're going to move on from there. Wi-Fi, I've just set it to the default settings. Bluetooth, you can pair your A7 IV with your phone if you want to, or with a Bluetooth remote like the Sony wireless grip or another wireless remote or some other Bluetooth remote. You can pair that here. And then I think that's it for this section over here. I guess for the network option, you can change the device name to whatever you want. For me, I've named the camera to be my initials and the camera itself. Kind of boring, you could name it whatever you want, but that's where you change the device name of the camera here. And then going down to the last tab, that's the operational tab. Here, of course, you can set your area, date, and time depending on where you are from. Same thing with the language. Moving down over here, this is actually where you get to install my A7 IV settings onto your camera. You can also save your very own A7 IV settings and save that to an SD card. And if you want to do that, you just go to the save load settings right over here. You can either load those settings in or save it or delete it. But yeah, if you want to install my A7 IV settings onto your camera, go to this section and click load, go to your SD card, and boom, camera twinsies. Moving on, the operation customization of the entire camera itself. We talked about the different buttons around my camera, but we didn't talk about the function menu settings. To remind you, if you want to access your function menu, you press this button over here. And in my function menu, here are my favorite features that I quite like to use. We're not going to go too deep into that because this area is very subjective. People have different preferences and they can add whatever features they want in their function menu setting. But real quick, on the top are my favorite photo settings and on the bottom are my favorite video settings. And for the photo settings, I have things like human, bird, eye, autofocus. I got anti-flicker. I have aspect ratio if I want to change the aspect ratio. If I do want to shoot time lapses, but with photos, I can use interval shooting right over here. Going down to the video portion of my function menu, I got things like audio record level, I got breathing compensation, and just other things here that I quite enjoy. Again, you can add whatever settings you want, whatever tickles your fancy, but a really cool way to access your favorite features of the camera. Moving out, is that it for this part of the section? Yeah, that's it for the section. Oh, and by the way, if you do want to customize your buttons around the camera, you can totally do so by going to custom key dial set, and then here it'll show you an image of your camera, and then you can just set whatever function you want. Really, it's totally cool. But moving on from that, let's see, dial customize, nothing there. Well, I guess the only thing that I did change in this section was the custom key dial. Basically, this is where I've like switched around the different functions of all the dials of my camera, and you can do the same thing in this section here. And then going back down, touch operation, I've set to the default settings. Accessibility, I don't touch. finder monitor. The only thing that I do change here is the monitor brightness. A lot of people say you have to use sunny weather in order for you to see the screen properly. Sometimes I find that the image looks a little bit too hot, and so I like using manual, and I've set the brightness setup to +1, and I find it to be somewhat accurate. The screens on the Sony cameras aren't the best, but yeah, I like using +1 for brightness setup. And everything else is set to default. And then going down, display options, gamma display assist, let's talk about that for a second. I do use that, but only when I'm shooting an S-Log3. It's totally not necessary if I'm shooting an S-Cinetone. And basically what gamma display assist does is that it takes your flat profile and turns it into a Rec. 709 image to give you an idea of what the image should look like. It's by all means not accurate at all. It just helps you see what the final video looks like. And I usually set that to auto, and the camera will recognize when I'm shooting an S-Log3, and when I do, it'll automatically turn it into a Rec. 709 image. And then moving on, we got power setting option. Ooh, this is very important. So the camera will turn off if it is starting to heat up. And if you don't want your camera to turn off when it gets a little warm, make sure to set the auto power off temperature to high. And that's pretty much all I set there. Moving on, sound option. When I'm playing back image, obviously the speaker on the camera is very small, and so I just set the volume settings to as high as possible, to 15. Nothing else to change here. Going back down, USB connection mode. Again, this is where I choose to stream with my A7IV by selecting the USB streaming option. I've already placed that setting to my favorites menu folder, and so we've already talked about that. And then moving on to external output. This is only for when you are recording video externally to a recorder like the Atomos Ninja 5, the recorder that I'm using right now to film the menu. And here you can determine the HDMI resolution and the output settings if you want. I've set the resolution to auto and the output resolution to 2160p. You can set it to auto if you want to, but I just like setting it to as high as possible. And if you do want to record your menu on the monitor, then make sure to set the HDMI info display on. And if you are live streaming, probably turn this feature off because you don't want the audience to see like your shutter speed, ISO, all that stuff. You just want to just leave everything off. But if you want to record all that onto your monitor, then of course make sure to select the HDMI info display on. And then for HDMI info display on, basically all the settings on your camera, from shutter speed to your menu to your volume levels, all that stuff, make sure to turn that on if you want to record those things onto a monitor. But if you are live streaming, it's probably best to turn that off because you don't want your audience to see your shutter speed, ISO. It's just too distracting. You want them to see a very clear image. But if you want to record all those things, then make sure to turn the HDMI info display on. And then lastly, for setup option, the only thing that I make sure is set is the video light mode. And basically it's that red light indicator to tell you that the A7IV is indeed recording. And of course, if you go down to version, it'll tell you what firmware version the A7IV is on. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Woo, that was a lot. Hopefully you kept up. Well, hopefully this video was helpful to you. Let me know if you have any questions down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.